Putin had officially lost all air supremacy over Moscow overnight. Ukraine arrived with hundreds of drones on the night of October, music, 26th to 27th. Footages shared on social media from Russian local accounts claimed that Ukraine's Flamingo missile flew over Russia. The flying object in the images resembles a Flamingo missile, and the date and time information in the lower left corner matches the timing of the attack. But it has not yet been confirmed exactly where these footages were taken. And music? How did Moscow respond? Now, these images are also from Russia's capital. Russian soldiers posing with simple Pete machine guns mounted on the beds of Chinese-made civilian pickup trucks at a dangerously close point to the Kremlin palace. Why are they here? Because Ukraine's relatively inexpensive kamikaze drones have plunged Putin into unprecedented fear. This fear has not only forced him to music dismantle billions of dollars worth of S-400, S-300, and Pantsir air defense systems from across the country and pile them around Moscow, it has also forced him to resort to these primitive last-ditch defense methods. In fact, just a few days ago, Vladimir Putin claimed that the new Russian missile with a range exceeding 14,000 kilometers was unstoppable. He tried to intimidate the US and Europe to ease the pressure. But all these efforts were in vain, and Ukraine's response came before Putin could even get up from the table he was boasting about. On the night of October 26th to 27th, a massive swarm attack involving hundreds of drones pierced through Putin's so-called impenetrable air defense fortress, which he had built with fear and at great cost. The Moscow defense collapsed within hours. So, how did Putin, touted as one of the world's most powerful leaders, end up having to mount machine music guns on Chinese-made pickup trucks to protect his capital? The answer lies in one word: fear. And this fear was woven music stitch by stitch by the blows struck to the heart of Moscow over the past year and a half. Ukrainian forces launched high-profile attacks on Moscow in May and August. So, 23, this event created music, the first serious perceived threat to Putin's personal security, and sparked deep panic in the Kremlin. These successive attacks forced Music Putin to make a radical decision. The order was clear. The capital would be transformed into an impregnable fortress. This Fortress Moscow project triggered an unimaginable transfer of resources, as confirmed by open-source intelligence reports, satellite images, and Ukrainian intelligence that emerged on October 26th. Russia began dismantling the most modern air defense systems from all over the country and piling them around Moscow. Russia did not have enough of the hundreds of modern air defense systems needed to surround the capital in its inventory. Therefore, these systems inevitably had to be dismantled from other vital regions, music of the country. Analyses by think tanks, such as the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, and statements by officials such as Music Kirilo Budanov, head of Ukrainian Defense Intelligence, confirmed this dangerous transfer of resources. Evidence has emerged that S-400 and Pantsir music batteries were dismantled and transported to Moscow from Kaliningrad on the Baltic Music Sea coast. Surrounded by NATO, from strategic nuclear submarine bases in the Far East, and even from active combat zones on the Ukrainian border, it has been reported that at least 21 new air defense bases have been built, or existing music ones reinforced around Moscow in the last 2 months. S-400 launchers have music been placed in parks and Pantsir systems on the roofs of tall buildings. Even the residence in Valdai, allegedly used by Putin as his personal retreat and shelter, has been surrounded by S-400s and Pantsirs. This was not a rational military strategy. It was a panic reaction focused on protecting a single point at the expense of weakening the country's overall defense. Acting out of his own fear, Putin had put all of Russia at risk to protect Moscow. And this castle, built out of fear, music would face its greatest test very soon, even within hours. And on the night of October 26th to 27th, the expected happened. Ukraine launched the largest drone swarm attack in history against Putin's so-called impregnable fortress Moscow. Built with fear and at great music cost, Putin's gamble of pouring all resources into the capital ultimately failed. The defense music was breached. The fortress fell. The chaos that night showed that the Kremlin had lost all control. The Russian Defense Ministry, unable to hide its panic, claimed to have shot down 193 UAVs, a figure that itself admitted the enormous scale of the attack. But the reality on the ground was very different and immediately exposed the mod's lies. Despite the powerful air defense, music shield worth billions of dollars that Putin had amassed around the capital, learning from previous attacks, Moscow was paralyzed. International airspace was closed in panic. The capital's two major gateways, Dodovo and Jakhovsky airports, were locked down for 2.5 hours. Serious delays were also experienced at Sheremetyevo and Vnukovo. The official statement was that this was a temporary measure taken for airspace security reasons, but thousands of passengers were stranded in the terminal. Flights were canceled and the runways were empty. Connecting flights were missed. Cargo transportation was disrupted. This meant that the capital's connection with the outside world, was effectively cut off. The sky was not silent. Explosions were heard one after another around Podolsk, Dubna, Troitsk, and Domodo. Black smoke rising from an oil depot near Kanaka seemed to contradict the statements that everything was fine. Although the RSB claimed there was no damage, images circulating on social media showed a fuel station engulfed in flames and the panicked faces of people trying to flee the city. But the real blow came from the invisible bomb panic. The attack, which began at midnight and lasted for hours, left people in a state of terrible uncertainty. Sirens were blaring, anti-aircraft fire could be heard, and conflicting information was circulating on social media. Should people go to shelters? Should they stay at home? How long would the attack last? What was the target? This uncertainty is the biggest trigger for panic. For years, Kremlin propaganda had assured the Russian people that the war was far away and that the motherland was safe. On the night of October 26th to 27th, that assurance was shattered. Millions of people experienced firsthand that their state could not protect them. This was not an attack. It was a saturation assault launched by Ukraine that left even Russia's most protected city helpless. This wave of attacks, which began around 10 p.m. on October 26th and lasted approximately 6 hours until the morning of October 27th, was Ukraine's largest, most comprehensive, and most strategically planned operation against Russian territory to date. So, how did this terrifying attack succeed so spectacularly? First, the numbers themselves reveal the gravity of the operation. The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed to have detected and destroyed a total of 193 Ukrainian UAVs that night. Even if this figure is accurate, it shows that the number of UAVs entering Russian airspace in a single night was staggering. This is many times greater than previous waves of attacks. However, what is critical is how these 193 UAVs were used. This was not a simple attack targeting a single target. The UAVs targeted more than 12 regions of Russia simultaneously. The distribution by region clearly revealed the strategy. Among the most heavily targeted regions, 47 UAVs were detected in Bryansk, 42 in Kuga, 32 in Tula, and at least 40 in the Moscow Oblast. At least 34 UAVs were reported to have reached Moscow city center. This wave of attacks was not limited to major cities. Strategic transit regions such as Oryol, Kursk, Voronezh, Smolensk, Lipetsk, and Tambov were also targeted one after another throughout the night. What do these numbers mean? This is a classic saturation attack tactic. The goal is to overload the enemy's air defense system by confronting it with too many targets at once to handle, thereby creating gaps in the defense shield. Ukraine has directed a large portion of its UAVs toward border regions, engaging Russian air defense batteries there. While these batteries are occupied with less important targets, critical corridors have been opened for unmanned aerial vehicles targeting Moscow, the main objective. The key to the success of this saturation attack lies in the principle of technological asymmetry. Most of the UAVs used by Ukraine were likely fixed-wing models such as the UJ-22 Airborne, which are relatively inexpensive, long-range, and capable of flying at low altitudes. These drones offer a tremendous cost-effectiveness advantage against Russia's sophisticated but cumbersome air defense systems, which cost billions of dollars. How did this asymmetry overwhelm Russian defenses? These fixed-wing UAVs are typically small, have a low radar signature due to being made of composite materials, and can fly close to the ground, remaining below radar coverage. Systems optimized for long-range, high-altitude targets such as the S-400 may struggle to detect or track such small, slow-moving targets. The Pantsir S-1 system, designed for short-medium-range defense, is theoretically more effective against drones. However, this system also has limitations. The number of targets it can track and engage simultaneously is limited. In a situation like the night of October 26th to 27th, when hundreds of UAVs arrived simultaneously from different directions, Pantsir batteries inevitably reach saturation. They cannot fire missiles at every target. The hit rate of the missiles they fire is not 100%. And most importantly, their missiles can run music out. The cost of a Pantsir missile can reach hundreds of thousands of dollars. Russia is forced to spend a missile that is many times more expensive to stop a drone that costs a few tens of thousands of dollars. This is an unsustainable defense equation in the long run. Ukraine is also wearing down Russia economically. Russia has to spend a fortune to defend its own airspace. Even if the RSB's claim of "we shot down 193 UAVs" is true, this does not mean that none of the UAV's music reached their target or breached the defense. The purpose of saturation attacks is not to hit 100% of the targets, but to overload the defense, music ensuring that some of them inevitably reach their targets. The closure of Moscow airports, music reports of explosions in places like Podolsk and Dodovo, and claims that an oil depot in Kamenaka was hit show that this penetration operation was successful. Moreover, this attack was not a shock that emerged overnight. It is the culmination of a step-by-step collapse created by the combination of Ukraine's increasing audacity and the chronic weaknesses of Russian air defense. The myth of Fortress Moscow, built by Putin with billions of dollars of investment, had been breached many times before it was razed to the ground that night. The first real blow to the Fortress Moscow myth occurred on the night of May 3, 2023. That night, 2 small kamikaze drones of unknown origin managed to reach the Kremlin palace itself. One of the drones crashed into the dome of the Senate building, causing a small explosion and fire. The physical damage from this attack was minimal. However, its psychological impact was priceless. This was the first time since the beginning of the war that the enemy had come so close to Russia's political and symbolic center. The myth of Moscow's impenetrable air defense shield suffered a serious blow that night. If even the Kremlin was not safe, where in Moscow was safe? The Kremlin's response to this attack reflected an atmosphere of panic and loss of control. They initially tried to cover up the incident, but were forced to admit it due to videos leaked on social media. They then threatened retaliation, accusing Ukraine of a terrorist attack and an assassination attempt on Putin. However, this angry reaction actually showed how shaken and embarrassed the regime was. The question of how 2 small drones managed to bypass the layered, and expensive air defense network surrounding Moscow and reach the Kremlin revealed serious weaknesses in Russian air defenses against small, low-flying targets. Just a few months after the Kremlin attack in August 2023, Ukrainian attacks entered a new phase. They directly targeted Moscow's civilian and economic center. In successive attacks, kamikaze drones crashed into skyscrapers in the Moscow City District, the city's modern financial center. The IQ Quarter Tower, home to the Ministry of Digital Development, Economic Development, Industry, and Trade, was targeted multiple times. What was the historical significance of these attacks? These attacks demonstrated that the war could now be fought not only on distant fronts, but also on Moscow's most modern, wealthiest, and most Western-facing face. The explosions and damaged skyscrapers brought the war directly to the windows of Moscow's white-collar workers, business people, and bureaucrats. The targeting of the financial center sent a message not only of physical damage, but also of economic insecurity. The fact that even an area central to foreign companies and Russian business was not safe diminished Moscow's appeal as a business hub. The fact that skyscrapers could be hit, repeatedly proved that even the additional measures taken after the Kremlin attack were ineffective. Following these shocking attacks in May and August 2023, a full-blown defense panic ensued at the Kremlin. The Putin regime could not accept that its capital was so defenseless. This was a terrible threat both to its domestic image and to Putin's personal security. How did the Kremlin respond to this panic? The Russian Ministry of Defense began dismantling air defense systems in other parts of the country, even on active front lines, and piling them around Moscow. An unprecedented cluster of S-400, S-350, S-300 and Pantsir S-1 batteries was detected around Moscow. Pantsirs were placed on rooftops and S-400 batteries were installed in parks. Moscow was theoretically surrounded by one of the world's most powerful air defense umbrellas. However, this defensive panic move had dire consequences. The systems withdrawn to protect Moscow left Russian troops on the Ukrainian front, border regions, such as Belgorod, Bryansk, or Crimea more vulnerable. This became one of the main factors enabling Ukraine's attacks in these areas to be more successful. Putin was sacrificing the rest of the country to protect Moscow. This buildup around Moscow was likely designed against ballistic missiles or fighter jets. However, its effectiveness against Ukraine's real threat, small, cheap swarm drones, was questionable from the outset. The Kremlin may have invested billions of dollars in the wrong type of defense. The anatomy music of the crisis also confirms how cleverly and effectively Ukraine played its hand on the strategic chessboard. By sending hundreds of UAVs, they physically overloaded Russian air defenses. At the same time, they also overloaded the Kremlin's propaganda machine. The RSB had to either accept the truth and admit failure, or tell a lie that would make them look ridiculous in the face of obvious facts. The Kremlin chose the latter and scored an own goal. Ukraine achieved this massive impact at a relatively low cost. So, what do these events mean in the bigger picture? The first and most important result of the strategic checkmate is the proof that Russia's multi-layered, sophisticated air defense fortress, built at a cost of billions of dollars and piled around Moscow at the expense of weakening other parts of the country, did not work. The second dimension of the strategic checkmate is psychological and may have even longer-term effects than the military failure. This attack has ultimately destroyed one of the most fundamental promises Putin has sold to the Russian people for years. For millions of Muscovites, war is no longer just a TV news story, but a reality that directly threatens their lives. Sirens, explosions, closed airports. These are undeniable evidence. Putin's narrative of a special military operation has now lost its credibility. The people